tears, almost echoes of Rilke. Remember those early moments in his first elegy? Beauty is the first touch of the tear that we think we can bear. There's no discourse of beauty. It's not wrestling in some way with the varieties of tear of the soul, of society, of structures, of institutions. And when it comes to black people, what makes black people lovers of wisdom at our best. I didn't come here to talk about the history of black thugs and gangsters. I could spend a lot of time on that. But I'm talking about black people at our best. That the highlight, that strength and the sources and resources that allow us to persevere in the face of the hatred and terror and trauma. See, that's why when my dear brother Simon says, Brother West, blues man in the life of the mind, he is exactly right. That I stand with Bessie Smith and Ma Rainey and Howlin' Wolf. I stand with Robert Johnson and Leroy Carr. I stand with various blues persons, the blues in Aretha, the blues in Luther, the blues in Billy, not as entertainers, but they're persons who decide to be love warriors in their artistry, wounded healers in their artistry. It's hard to find a figure who spread more joy in the most barbaric of centuries of recorded time, which is the 20th century. It's hard to find a figure who spreads more joy than Louis Armstrong. My mom's Mabley. Some of the graduates of this grand institution, if not graduates, they passed through. We were just there, the 95th anniversary of our dear brother Harry Belafonte. He got that new school stamp. The genius from the south side of Chicago, Lorraine Hansberry, got that stamp, new school stamp. Marlon Brando, we know he's not chocolate, but he's about as chocolate as he can get. He's like Harold Arlen. He's about as chocolate as they come on the vanilla side of town. Marlon Brando's got that new school stamp. So does the great Stella Adler. We could go on and on and on. These are they who have tried to stay in contact with Du Bois's great challenge, which is to muster the courage to face oppression with integrity and to face deception with honesty and to face insult with decency and to face brute force with courage. And to live at a moment in which the commodification and the marketization of nearly every nook and cranny of our society makes it very difficult to even keep alive certain memories of genuine integrity. It's just been reduced to cupidity. And by cupidity, I mean not just love of money, but I'm using it in the Augustinian sense, the way Hugo of St. Victor used it. The dominant ways of the world that reminds us of Clausewitz, the philosopher of war. What Hegel meant when he said history is a slaughterhouse. What Gibbon meant when Gibbon said history is a series of crimes and follies. And I like that last word, follies, because we talked today about Sebastian Brant's Ship of Fools, 1419, 2 years after the encounter of Europeans with precious indigenous brothers and sisters and the embarking on the subjugation, you see. And then in Praise of Folly, a text that I hope every undergraduate and graduate student gets a chance to read in these dim times. There's no way you can engage in philosophical, intellectual, resource gathering without some sense of the comic and the humorous and the satirical. Let me just raise hands of all of the students who are undergrads and graduate students in the place right now. Raise your hand. Let's give them a hand. Let's give them all a hand. I hope you all, I hope and pray that this is not just some kind of off-the-wall lecture that you go to and go back home and don't feel in any way subject to self-interrogation and transformation. No, there's some text to shake your world, take you into the lower frequencies of the funk master activity. That's what Erasmus does in 1511. But Lucian, the greatest of all comic writers in the West that would mean so much to Mark Twain and Ishmael Reed and Nathaniel West and Charlie Chaplin, Lenny Bruce, Phyllis Diller, so many of the great comic. Well, I'm not talking about these comedians these days just coming and talk about whoever's sitting on the front row. No, that's Hobbesian conceptions of humor. It's just sudden glory. You're just reveling in the misfortunes of somebody else. That's not the comic in its deepest sense. We're talking about Lucian. We're talking about Erasmus. We're talking about Joyce. We're talking about Beckett. And of course, the deepest of them all for me is Chekhov, along with the blues, the tragic comic at the deepest level. And there's no way that we will ever be equipped to deal with our present circumstances, the effects and consequences of the various structures of domination and exploitation, the ways in which the market has so thoroughly colonized our minds and hearts and souls that it's hard to even conceive of being agents collectively organized or even individual in our relationships, because intimacy and vulnerability have been so thoroughly called into question. That's one of the reasons why we're experiencing a moment of not just polarization. Again, that's just deodorized talk. America's not polarized. America's polarized and gangsterized. And gangsterization is different than polarization. It cuts much deeper. Where's my dear brother who was teaching at NYU dealing with Black Lives Matter? Just wave your hand, brother. So good to see you. Give it up for this brother. He's now at the new school. Now at the new school. Oh, yes. We had wonderful time together in class. And we talked about it then. Gangsterization is about the enactment of wholesale nihilism, which is not simply epistemic skepticism or ontological skepticism. It is lovelessness. It is touchlessness. It is meaninglessness. It is what Dostoevsky called hell in Brothers Karamazov, which is wrestling with the incapacity to love because the gifts that one has been given have not been cultivated in such a way that you even know how to love anymore. So even the discourse of love and justice, and any justice that's only justice, soon degenerates into something less than justice. If all you got to offer is just justice and you're not doing it because you really love and have a care and concern about the people catching hell, it's just a lifestyle choice. It's not a fundamental way of being in the world. That's what we learned the best in the new school. Oh, yes. Even when we have contested conceptions of what justice is. That's how dim and grim our situation is. And we were talking in class about that line of Immanuel Kant, the Critique of Pure Reason, where he says examples are the go-kart of judgment. You have to have concrete exemplars. And I'm not talking about abstract market-driven role models. So-and-so's my role model. Oh, please, spare me. Probably just talking about some market success. You just want some big move in your career. We're not talking about career today. We're talking about your calling and the way you use your career for your calling. And you can't have a calling without a recalling, a relation to the voices, the figures, the exemplars who have come before, who shape us and mold us. And if there's going to be any kind of serious philosophy, love of wisdom in a moment of imperial decay, countervailing truth-telling against the present status quo, countervailing organizing against the status quo, countervailing arguments, countervailing stories, countervailing analysis, counter-hegemonic ways of being in the world. It has everything to do with basic things like trying to get us to see the world more clearly, comprehensively, with a subtlety and sense of complexity that is inseparable from feeling deeply and shattering callousness and indifference, so that we actually can have genuine care and solidarity. And last but not least, most importantly, being willing to act. It's no accident that irony remains so often the dominant trope of the professional managerial classes when it comes to education. Because irony allows us to revel in how smart we are, which is a beautiful thing. I'm not promoting stupidity up here. But if we're reveling in our smartness and unable to acknowledge the forms of complicity and complacency and cowardliness, given what we're willing to adopt ourselves to without being truthful about ourselves, then smartness becomes just another kind of rationalizing the hierarchies in place, the forms of silence in place, the forms of taboo in place. And none of us, not one of us, are free of spot or wrinkle. What I mean by that is that all of the lenses through which we view the world have blind spots. Adorno reminds us of this: the splinter in one's own eye is the biggest magnifying glass. So you start with yourself. No one of us have a monopoly on truth and beauty and goodness of the whole. No one of us are part of any pure social movement that allows a Manichaean analysis as if we are on the one side, all light, good, and purity, and all those who disagree with us are to be demonized. No, leave that for Disneyland. And the popcorn on Main Street. And come back to history with all of its contradictions and incongruities, and the history deposited inside of us. We wrestle with this these days in terms of robust conversation. How far do we go in listening to people who we fundamentally disagree with? Are we to wrestle with the genius of an Edmund Burke, who was so cold and callous when it came to precious brothers and sisters in the French Revolution, but had a powerful critique of British imperial practices in India? Disagree, wrestle, find your voice, but don't shut him out. Not at all. Wouldn't have had the responses of Mary Shelley. We wouldn't have had the responses of Diderot and others in the conversation. I had a challenge the other day. Somebody in my class said, "You know, Brother West, I'm a white sister, and I just feel as if I can't say too much about the great Baba Ambedkar. You know, the great Ambedkar, the great Dalit intellectual, critical of Gandhi, because Gandhi was against untouchability but did not call for the dismantling of caste." I said, "Well, what makes you think your white body's getting in the way?" Please, don't fetishize this thing. use your imagination and your empathy. John Brown wasn't no joke. Lady Maria Child, white sister, wasn't no joke. Close to David Walker. What are we talking about? Rabbi Heschel ain't no joke writing that telegram to Kennedy. I think Americans ought to forfeit the right to worship if they can't treat Negroes with humiliation. Kennedy said, I think we invited the wrong rabbi here. Because we got some more moderate rabbis out here who just can't wait to get to the White House and sip tea. Well, Heschel's not going to do it. He's not doing it just because of his skin pigmentation. He believes in something deeply. He's got a calling. He's got a sense of invocation. His conception of piety is grounded in remembrance of the best, reverence of something bigger than him, and a resilience and a resistance in the light of his prophetic understanding of his own Judaic tradition. What a magnificent witness. Does he have a monopoly on truth? No. Does he have some truths that are indispensable? Absolutely. Say the same thing about my prophetic brother Malcolm X. I don't exist as a Christian without Malcolm X. Does he have some blind spots? Absolutely. Early Malcolm, later Malcolm, less so, but still has them. And I'm just using brief examples because you can't be one who wants to take seriously my own tradition of black folk who have chosen to be love warriors and freedom fighters and wounded healers and joy spreaders. You violate Frederick Douglass. You violate Ida B. Wells Barnett. You violate James Baldwin. You violate Aretha Franklin. You violate John Coltrane. You violate Mary Lou Williams. All of these were human beings who somehow mustered the courage to be lovers of beauty and truth and goodness, and sometimes the holy. Mary Lou became a Catholic under the influence of Barry Ulanoff and a few others. She had been very much secular in her own way. Dorothy Day, another great example. Thoroughly secular for a minute, and then is converted to Catholicism. People, oh my God, what happened to Dorothy? No, she still has anarchistic sensibilities. No, she's in love with poor folks. She is a leftist to the core in terms of her hybrid spirit as Catholic Dorothy Day. Mary House, just right down the way here, still going, 89 years later. Why do I mention all this? I could talk about a Buddhist who New School had the vision to bring. Our dear Sister Bell Hooks. God, we miss Sister Bell. What has this got to do with wrestling with empirical decay? Everything. Everything. Because if we are unable to be Blues-like, be Chekhov-like, to be Beckett-like, and have a sense of the tragic comic, which means that oftentimes the best of who we are, democratic movements, democratic ways of life, are episodic. They come and go like the great Sheldon Wolin taught us in Fugitive Democracy. Often crushed. Well, what do we do in the face of being defeated? What do you think? What do we do in the face of failure? What do you think? What do we do when it looks like this at times that our very movement has the chance of a snowball in hell? Do we give up? Do we succumb? Blues men, blues women, what you got to say? Oh, Brother West, I've been down so long, the down don't worry me no more. That's why I just keep it on and I'm strong as I can be. Ooh, I like your blues. Ain't nothing innocent about it, nothing sentimental about it, nothing romantic about it, nothing naive about it. It's grounded in the funk and the realities of struggling, but at the same time, it understands hope as a verb as well as a virtue. You got this, Curtis Mayfield say, keep on pushing. Stay in motion, not just by yourself, some isolated ego. Enact subversive piety. What is subversive piety? Well, we can go back to the youth fro and wrestle over definitions. Or we can go with John Dewey and say, I'm a naturalist, I'm secular. Piety is the virtuous acknowledgement of the sources of good in our lives, so that even we atheists and even we agnostics know that there have been people in our lives who fundamentally shape and mold who we are. I love that about Sister Jackson. The other day, I don't get a chance to watch TV too often. She starts with her parents. You see, all of the cynicism and skepticism and even threats of nihilism in the world should never allow any of us to overlook the forces of good in our own treks from womb to tomb. Who loved us? Who cared for us? Who sacrificed for us? How did it spill over in family and community? How did it spill over in school? How did it spill over in sports? How did it spill over in music? And then how did it spill over for those who were no longer quick and breathing but to dead? Feeling down and out, turn on some Stephen Sondheim. Let that brother's genius flow through your soul. I'm talking about the tragic comic sections, not just those upbeat ones that he got from Oscar Hammerstein. This is not June busting out all over. This is No More in part 2 of Into the Woods. This is a Stephen Sondheim who says dreams come true but not free. Because when Cinderella finally gets her prince, she finds out he's not worth a dime. What you gonna do now, Cinderella? That's part 2. That's after Disneyland. That's after the sentimentalism. Once upon a time thing. Oh, no, you got to live a life in the dark, in the grim, in the dimness. Blues-like. And let us be very clear. Not just in the American empire, but in the world. Ecological catastrophe, impending nuclear catastrophe. Gangsters have their hands on the button. Economic catastrophe, thank God for Brother Bernie. People call him Johnny One Note, the critique of Wall Street over and over again. At least he's got that critique up front because it's tied to corporate greed. It's not just economic, it's moral, it's spiritual. And then the political catastrophe of our elected officials wrestling with colonized bribery and normalized corruption shot through their practices. What are we to do? How do we sustain ourselves? Vocation, invocation, provocation. You can't do it by yourself. You've got to situate and locate yourself in a tradition that has been able to empower others before you. That's why we talked about Vico today. That's why we talked about Montaigne today with the 8 wars of religion from 1562 to 1592.